The wine was already poured. It stood in its crystal glass on the sideboard of the Queen's withdrawing room, a deep garnet in the early afternoon light, catching the flame from the nearest candelabra in a way that made it look almost warm, almost innocent. The other ladies in waiting had already stepped back, their tasks complete, their heads inclined at the correct angle, their expressions composed in the way that court ladies learn to compose them, impassive as painted porcelain, revealing nothing. The Queen's hand was extended, fingers slightly spread, waiting for the glass to be placed there. Cecily stood at the sideboard. Her hands were at her sides. She did not move. The silence that opened up in that room was not the comfortable silence of a household running smoothly. It was the other kind, the kind that precedes a verdict, the kind that draws the breath of everyone present into a single-held space and does not release it. Lady Portia Stanhope, First Lady of the Bedchamber, turned from the window where she had been standing and fixed her gaze on Cecily with an expression so perfectly controlled that only the slight elevation of one brow betrayed her attention. The Queen's fingers remained extended, patient in the way that queens learn to be patient. Not from temperament, but from years of understanding that the world will eventually arrange itself to their requirements. Cecily felt the weight of every eye in the room. She felt the particular weight of Lady Portia's eye. She stood still. It was not defiance in the usual sense. She was not making a speech. She was not drawing herself up or setting her jaw in the theatrical manner of women in novels who discover their courage. She was simply not lifting the glass because she could not lift it. And the reason she could not lift it had been written into her understanding 6 years ago, in a still room not unlike this one, by a man whose hands had shaken as he showed her the thing she now recognized in the air above that wine. A faint, sweet edge beneath the tannin. Barely there. The kind of thing that would be missed by everyone in this room except the daughter of a court physician who had loved his work enough to teach it to a child who had loved him enough to learn. Her father had called it the scholar's compound, for the way it worked slowly, with patience, without violence, in the manner of a very patient scholar settling an old account. He had described it with the care he gave to everything dangerous, precisely, gravely, his eyes on hers to make certain she understood. He had not taught her to fear it. He had taught her to recognize it. She recognized it now. She did not move. The morning that Cecily Vane had first arrived at court was a gray October morning of the previous year, the kind that settles over London like a damp cloth and refuses to lift until well past noon. She had come with 2 trunks, a maid she could not afford to keep past the end of the month, and an appointment that represented everything the Vane family had left in the world. Her father, Dr. Edmund Vane, had died 18 months before that morning, stripped of his court position and his dignity and eventually his health over the course of a 3-year accusation that had proved, in the end, to have no foundation whatsoever, except that the patient who had died was Lord Carbourne's eldest son, and the Carbournes had needed a reason for the death that did not reflect upon their own household, and a physician's daughter from a minor family of no political weight had seemed a convenient reason to provide. The inquiry had cleared Edmund Vane's name, formally, in 2 careful sentences, 4 months after his death. The restoration of his reputation had come too late to restore anything else. Cecily had received the appointment the following spring, a junior post among the Queen's ladies, arranged through the quiet influence of an old friend of her father's, who had enough conscience left to feel the obligation. She had accepted it with the particular gratitude of someone who understands that gratitude is the only currency available. The court had known who she was within a week. It was Lady Portia Stanhope who had named her first, in the antechamber outside the Queen's morning room, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to carry 2 steps in either direction without appearing to project. She had been speaking to Lady Honoria Blaine, the current diamond of the household, a young woman of 22 with the coloring of a Flemish painting and the manner of someone who has never needed to consider the cost of a meal. Lady Honoria had been examining a new length of ribbon. Lady Portia had set down her own embroidery with the precision of a woman placing a coin on a table. "One must be charitable," she had said, not looking toward Cecily. "To the physician's disgraced daughter. She has very little else." Lady Honoria had looked up from the ribbon, caught Cecily's eyes across the room for one unguarded moment, and looked away again. She had the grace, at least, to color slightly. Lady Portia had the grace to color not at all. Cecily had continued with her own work. She had learned, from the years of her father's ordeal, that a composed face is the only private space a woman without money or rank can claim as her own. She claimed it now and daily and gave nothing away. What she did not give away, she gave to Agnes. Agnes Devereux was 19 years old and had arrived at court 3 weeks after Cecily. Sent by a Northumberland family who hoped proximity to the Queen's household would translate eventually into an advantageous match, she was small and fine-boned and possessed of an expressiveness that court life had not yet managed to discipline out of her. Her face showed everything, every slight, every small unkindness, every cutting remark delivered with a smile. Cecily had recognized her vulnerability the first afternoon they shared a sitting room, when Agnes had cried quietly into a handkerchief after a remark from Lady Portia, and then looked up with the expression of someone who expected to be witnessed in her humiliation. Cecily had said nothing about the tears. She had simply moved her chair closer and asked Agnes to help her with the letter she was writing, because the light was too poor to see her own hand clearly. Agnes had composed herself in the time it took to answer. She had seemed, since then, to understand that Cecily's proximity was offered as shelter, not pity, and she had accepted it accordingly. This was the manner of Cecily's life at court in the autumn and winter of that year. She performed her duties with precision, absorbed what the hierarchy sent in her direction without visible response, and kept her father's small glass vial on its ribbon, beneath her collar, against her breastbone, close enough to feel when she breathed. She had brought it with her not as a talisman, but as a discipline. The vial had been part of her father's teaching kit. He had kept 6 of them in a wooden case lined with green baize, each containing a trace of a different compound, each stoppered with wax, each labeled in his small, careful hand. When she was 12 years old, he had sat her at the table in his still room on a winter afternoon and opened the case before her with the same expression he wore when he considered something worth understanding. He had unstopped each vial in turn and held it beneath her nose, not close enough to overwhelm, just close enough to distinguish. He had asked her to describe what she detected, not with chemical vocabulary she did not yet have, but with whatever words came. She had said bitter and green, like the underside of a leaf. She had said warm, like something shut up in a closed room. She had said sweet in a way that makes the back of your throat tighten. He had looked at her with such steady approval at that last one that she had remembered the expression for the rest of her life. That vial she wore now. It contained what the others had not. The scholar's compound, prepared by him in a quantity no larger than a drop of water, as much for the exercise as for any practical purpose, he had said, giving it to her on the morning she turned 16, that he hoped she would never need the knowledge. But that knowledge shaped into a tool was more valuable than knowledge kept only in the mind. She had thought, when he gave it to her, that she understood what he meant. She understood it better now. It reminded her of what it cost to know something and say nothing. It reminded her of the difference between a silence that protects and a silence that abets. It was this discipline, carried daily through the corridors of a palace that left her standing at the sideboard with her hands at her sides on a cold afternoon in January, looking at a glass of wine she knew she could not serve. The Queen lowered her hand. No one spoke. For a period of perhaps 10 seconds, which felt considerably longer, not one of the 6 women in that room moved or made a sound. Then Lady Portia took one step forward, which was enough to break the spell, and the room came back to itself in the manner of a stage recovering from a missed cue, with a slight rustle of fabric, someone's breath released, someone's fan half raised, and then lowered again. "Miss Vane," Lady Portia said. Her voice was very even. Cecily had spent enough time in her company to understand that evenness as a measurement of temperature, where the more controlled the surface, the more active the calculation beneath it. "Your Grace," Cecily said. She was addressing the Queen, not Portia. "I cannot serve the wine. There is something in it that should not be there." The silence that followed was a different kind from the first. This one had a shape to it. The shape of surprise and the particular alertness that surprise produces in people who understand that they are in the presence of something that will need to be managed. Lady Honoria Blaine's fan came fully open. The youngest of the ladies, a Miss Trent, backed one step without appearing to do it deliberately. The Queen was looking at Cecily with an expression that Cecily could not quite read. It was not anger. It was not quite belief either. It was the considered face of a woman who has spent a life being given information of varying truthfulness and has learned to hold it at a certain distance while she decides what to do with it. "Remove the glass," the Queen said. She said it to the room in general, and Lady Portia moved to comply, her hand closing around the stem with a steadiness that Cecily noted and did not comment upon. The First Lady of the bedchamber carried the glass from the room without looking at Cecily again. The door closed behind her with precisely the correct degree of firmness. The room rearranged itself around the fact of what had just happened. By that evening, the senior ladies had assembled in Lady Portia's sitting room on the first floor, and Cecily had been summoned. The summons came via a footman, which was itself a kind of comment, since ladies of the household were ordinarily communicated with by a note in another lady's hand. She had gone, because the alternative to going was a kind of cowardice she did not permit herself. And she had stood before them with her hands folded and her face arranged in its composure, and listened to what was said to her. Lady Portia had conducted the interview from her usual chair, with Lady Honoria to her left, and 2 of the senior ladies on the settee. She had asked Cecily to explain the circumstance of the afternoon with an expression of such perfect neutrality that only the slight tension in her jaw betrayed anything at all. Cecily had explained it. She had described the smell and its nature, and her father's instruction, in the same clear, factual register she would use later with Lord Ashmore. When she had finished, Lady Portia had looked at her for a long moment. "We must all of us be charitable," she said at last, "toward the physician's disgraced daughter. It is quite natural, I am sure, that a person of such a history might find shadows where there are none. The wine was entirely in order. I prepared it myself." There had been a silence. Lady Honoria looked down at her own hands. One of the senior ladies had made a sound that was almost agreement. Cecily had said, "Then the glass can be analyzed, my lady." Lady Portia had said, "The glass has been cleaned." Cecily had said nothing further. She had curtsied and withdrawn, and in the corridor she had stood very still for a moment, with her hand against the wall, feeling the cold plaster through her glove, and had understood that the next hours would determine everything. Lord Gideon Ashmore arrived at the palace at 10:30 the following morning. He came with a letter from the Privy Council and 2 attendants and the manner of a man who has been sent to do an unpleasant thing efficiently and intends to complete it before luncheon. He was tall, in the way that certain men who have spent years in large rooms learn to carry themselves, not aggressive, but certain, the kind of physical authority that does not need announcement. He was 35, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and a face that would have been handsome in a warmer arrangement of its features. It was not warm. It was very still, the stillness of stone rather than ice, something that had been carved into its current shape by weather and time, rather than by calculation. He had been the Earl of Chetford for 7 years. He had served the Privy Council for 5. He had, in that time, investigated a land fraud in Somerset, a forgery of crown patents in the north of England, and a bribery scheme involving 3 peers of sufficient rank that the resolution of the matter had been handled with exceptional delicacy and was not discussed publicly. He was not a man who failed to complete what he was sent to complete. The Queen received him in her formal sitting room. Cecily was present in her capacity as one of the attending ladies, standing near the window with her hands folded and her face arranged in its usual composure. She was aware of the moment he noticed her, not because he looked at her for longer than the brief survey he gave the whole room on entering, but because something in the quality of his gaze changed fractionally when it reached her, as if he had located the relevant document. He interviewed her that afternoon, in the small room the Chamberlain made available, at a table with a good fire and 2 chairs placed at a practical distance. He sat with his hands flat on the surface before him and asked his questions in the same level declarative tone a man might use to read a report aloud. "You identified the substance by smell," he said. "Yes, my lord." "From your father's instruction?" "Yes." "At what age were you given this instruction?" "Between the ages of 10 and 16, she said. He believed the knowledge was worth possessing. The Earl looked at her for a moment without speaking. She did not look away. "What is the compound?" he said. She named it, using the Latin she had been taught, the common name, and the 3 distinguishing characteristics her father had described, which were its sweet edge, the particular temperature at which it became volatile enough to detect, and the way it left a faint film on glass that evaporated within 2 hours of preparation. She spoke clearly, without performance, watching his face for the adjustment that would tell her whether he was listening or simply waiting for the moment he could dismiss her. He was listening. He said at the end, "The glass was removed before it could be analyzed." "Yes, my lord." "By Lady Stanhope." "I did not see who removed it." "No," he said, "but you saw who poured it." Cecily said nothing. He had not asked a question. He dismissed her with a brief nod and returned his attention to the paper before him. She was at the door when he said, without looking up, "Miss Vane, you will eat something this evening." It was not a suggestion. "You have not, I am told, taken a proper meal since yesterday morning." She turned. He was still looking at the paper. There was something in the angle of his head, the deliberate quality of his attention to the document, as if he were keeping it there by will, and she understood that the question about her meals had not come from administrative thoroughness. She did not allow herself to hold that observation too long. "I am not unwell, my lord," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you are useful to this investigation only if you remain so. Eat something." She left without answering. In the corridor, the cold air of the palace passage met her face, and she was aware, in the precise and slightly inconvenient way that the body registers what the mind is not prepared to examine, that her hands were not entirely steady. She folded them at her waist and kept walking. She attributed the unsteadiness to the fire in the room, which had been warmer than necessary, and to the strain of the last 24 hours, and did not examine it further than that. If you have followed her this far, you have already guessed that she did not, for some time, allow herself to examine it further. That is a particular kind of courage. though it rarely looks like one. The evening of the third day of the investigation, Cecily remained in the antechamber to the Queen's library after the other ladies had retired. She had a journal open before her, one she had kept for 3 years. Not a diary, nothing personal, but a working copy of the notes her father had kept, written out in her own hand, so that the knowledge would not be lost if something happened to his originals. She had been promising herself, for months, that she would finish transcribing the section on mineral compounds and present the completed volume to Agnes's father, who was a physician in Northumberland, and had written to her once, very kindly, after her father's death. She worked without a candle, relying on the fire, which was sufficient for her purposes. The scratch of her pen was the only sound in the room. She did not hear the door. What Lord Ashmore saw, standing in the doorway of the antechamber, was a woman sitting at a writing table with her back straight and her head bent over an open journal, working by firelight because she had not lit a candle, which meant she had been there long enough for the fire to settle into a reliable source and had not considered the absence of additional light worth interrupting herself for. She was writing quickly. Not the quick writing of someone hurrying to finish. The quick writing of someone in full command of what they are putting down, who does not need to pause for words because the words were determined long before the pen was lifted. He recognized this quality of industry. It was not common at court, where industry was most often performed rather than done. It was the quality of a person working when no one was watching, which meant it was the person's actual manner, and not a cultivated appearance of it. He stood in the doorway for what was perhaps a full minute. He was not, precisely, deciding anything. He was simply watching a woman do her father's work in a palace that had destroyed her father, by firelight, alone, without self-pity, without audience, with a steadiness that had no performance in it at all. She heard, eventually, a slight shift in the quality of the silence that told her the room had acquired another occupant. She raised her head. Lord Ashmore stood in the doorway, his coat still on, as if he had come from outside, one hand resting against the frame. In the firelight, the gray at his temples was more pronounced. He looked at the open journal, and then at her face, and did not, immediately, speak. She was aware, in the particular way the body notices things the mind refuses to address directly, that he had been standing there for longer than a moment. "Your father's notes," he said. It was not quite a question. "A copy of them," she said. "I have been preparing a fair version for a colleague of his." She closed the journal carefully. "I did not hear you, my lord." "No," he said. He came into the room then, not toward her, but toward the fireplace. Stopping some distance away and looking at the fire in the manner of a man who has been thinking for a long time about something other than what is in front of him. "The apothecary has confirmed the compound," he said. "The glass was recovered from Lady Stanhope's rooms this afternoon. There was sufficient residue on the cloth she used to clean it." Cecily felt something move through her that she could not precisely name, a release, perhaps, of a pressure she had been holding since the afternoon of the refusal. She had been right. She had been right. And the refusal had been the correct act. And her father's teaching had been worth everything it had cost. "Then the matter is resolved," she said. "Not yet," he said. "Lady Stanhope has not admitted the origin of the compound. She will say it was decorative, that she had it for another purpose, that she could not have known it was in the wine." He turned from the fire. "The council will require your testimony, not your account of what you smelled, though that is on record, but your demonstration that you understand the compound well enough that your identification is credible. An expert's identification, not a guess." She understood. "You need me to prove that I am not simply afraid of wine." He looked at her steadily. "I need to prove that you are precisely what I believe you to be," he said. And then he looked back at the fire, as if he had not said it. The room was very quiet. She thought about the portrait she had noticed in the small office he had been assigned. A young woman in a blue gown. The painting turned very slightly toward the wall, enough to shade it from the window's direct light, not enough to make the turning seem intentional. She thought about the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at ease, but the stillness of a man who has spent years holding something at a careful distance from his own center and has become very skilled at the practice. She did not ask about the portrait. She said, "I can prepare a written account of the compound's properties. With the vial I carry, which contains a trace sample my father prepared, the court apothecary will be able to confirm the match." He looked at her. "You carry it." "Always," she said. "I have worn it since his death." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Vane," and moved toward the door. "My lord," she said. He paused without turning. "You were not wrong," she said quietly, "about what I am." He left. She sat for a moment longer in the firelight, the closed journal under her hand, and did not allow herself to think too carefully about the particular quality of the stillness he had taken from the room with him. Something in this story requires you to stay, because what comes next is what everything before it has been building toward. What Cecily did not yet know, as she sat with her father's notebook in the firelight, was that Lady Portia Stanhope had not spent the last 3 days idle. Portia was 58, had been First Lady of the Bedchamber for 11 years, and had survived more investigations and political reversals than Lord Ashmore had yet been born to witness. She understood that the compound's discovery was a blow. She understood also that a blow is not a defeat. She had spent the last 11 years learning the difference, and she had learned it from people considerably more dangerous than a Privy Council inquiry. On the evening of the 4th day, she moved. She had in her possession a letter. She had prepared it with considerable care over a period of weeks, in anticipation of a moment she had hoped would not arrive, but had always understood might. It was written in a hand she had studied and practiced until it was very nearly indistinguishable from the original. It bore the name Edmund Vane at the close. It described, in the language of a desperate man composing a private record of his intentions, a plan to discredit the Queen's household from within through an act of violence designed to be blamed on a foreign party, specifically on the Duchess of Brouwer, the Queen's current favorite, who was Bavarian and therefore, in certain political quarters, suspect by definition. It was a brilliant piece of work. It placed the Vane family in the position of the original conspirators, redirected the investigation entirely, and gave the council a reason to dismiss Cecily's testimony as the product of a calculated design rather than an honest act. It had the additional elegance of destroying the very people who had done nothing to Portia at all, which was a kind of perfection she had always found aesthetically pleasing in a stratagem. The letter was placed in the Lord Chamberlain's hands on the morning of the 5th day. Agnes came to Cecily's rooms that afternoon with a face that had not been composed quickly enough. She told Lord Whitmore, Agnes said, "Lady Portia. I heard her in the gallery. She said he ought not to rely on the testimony of the physician's disgraced daughter, that the Vane family has debts older than the appointment, that there is a letter." Cecily set down the pen she had been holding. "She said there is a letter in your father's hand," Agnes said, her voice very small. "That proves your father intended the very thing you have accused her of." The silence in the room was a different kind from the silence in the withdrawing room 5 days ago. That one had been charged, held, full of the before. This one was the after, and it was considerably heavier. Cecily put the cap on her ink. She smoothed the paper before her with one hand. She felt the vial against her breastbone through the fabric of her gown, its glass edge cool and precise. "It is a forgery," she said. "I know that," Agnes said. "But who else will?" Lord Whitmore arrived at her rooms an hour later. He was a man of 60, courteous and regretful, who delivered the news with the expression of a man who genuinely did not enjoy the business. She was to be removed from her duties pending a formal inquiry. She was to remain available for questioning. She was to leave the palace before evening. She left with her 2 trunks and her maid, who had been in her service for 3 years longer than anticipated, because Cecily had found she could not dismiss a person whose loyalty was the primary constant in a year of uncertainty. She went to her mother's townhouse near Portman Square, which smelled of old fabric and cold mornings, and the specific absence of a man who had once filled it with the sound of work being done with care. She sat at her father's desk. The townhouse was cold in the way that houses go cold when they have been kept for economy rather than warmth. Fires banked low, rooms left unheated except the kitchen, and the one the occupant was actually in. Her mother had gone to bed with a headache that was not, Cecily thought, entirely physical. She sat alone at the desk in a dressing gown and did not light more than 1 candle, because one was sufficient to see by, and the discipline of sufficiency was one she had maintained so long it had become a reflex. She held the vial. The glass was cool in her palm, very smooth, worn to a warmth by years of contact with her skin. She turned it in her fingers. It was the size of a small finger, no longer. It contained 1 drop of the scholar's compound. It also contained, in the way that objects do when they have been kept long enough with purpose, something of her father's voice and her father's hands, and her father's specific way of looking at her when he was teaching her something he considered genuinely worth knowing. She thought about Lord Ashmore's face in the firelight, and about the portrait turned toward the wall, and about the way he had said she was precisely what he believed her to be, in the tone of a man who does not make such observations casually, and knows it, and cannot unsay them once they are said. She thought about his hands flat on the table during the interview, very still, and the way his voice had not changed when he asked her about her father's instruction, as though he understood already that the instruction had been an act of love rather than of professional habit. She was aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the candle or the dressing gown. She did not examine it. She put the vial down beside the candle, where the light caught it. Then she opened her father's original notebooks. She worked through the night. By morning she had assembled on 6 sheets of paper in her clearest hand a complete account of the compound, its properties, its historical use, its chemical markers, and the conditions under which it could be identified by a trained observer. She had cross-referenced 3 of her father's original entries, dated and signed, which established that the knowledge had been transmitted to her formally, over a period of years, in the manner of a documented education. She had attached the vial on its ribbon to the letter she addressed to Lord Ashmore, not as a plea, as evidence. She sent it at first light. She dressed. She sat. She waited. Lord Ashmore arrived at her door at 9:30. He did not come alone. He came with Lord Whitmore, the Lord Chamberlain, and a court apothecary named Mr. Fenwick, a precise man of perhaps 50 with ink-stained fingers, and the expression of someone who has spent a career being asked to render opinions that other people then chose to ignore. Lord Ashmore carried her letter. He also carried a second document, which she had not seen, which proved to contain the results of the independent analysis he had commissioned on the day of her removal, before the letter had arrived, before he had known she was assembling her evidence, because he had not required her testimony to tell him what his own inquiry had already established. He had, she understood, been building toward this for days. They convened in the formal council chamber at 11:30. Lady Portia Stanhope was present, seated to the left of the long table, with Lady Honoria Blaine at her side and 2 men of legal counsel behind her. Cecily was shown to a chair on the right. Lord Ashmore stood at the head of the table with the 2 documents and the vial, which Mr. Fenwick had examined that morning and confirmed contained a substance chemically identical to the residue recovered from the cloth in Lady Portia's rooms. The letter was read aloud. Portia, Cecily noticed, was very still during the reading. She sat with the stillness of someone who has placed a bet and is calculating very quickly the odds. Lord Ashmore spoke for approximately 10 minutes. He described the sequence of the investigation, the recovery of the cloth, the identification of the compound, and the independent apothecary's analysis, which had been conducted by a man who had no knowledge of Cecily's identity or her father's history. He set out the 6 sheets of documented knowledge she had sent him that morning. He described the method by which her identification of the compound had been made, and the conditions under which it was made, and the probability, given the documented evidence of her education, that it was a guess rather than a trained recognition. He placed her father's original notebooks, which he had retrieved from the palace archives where they had been held since Edmund Vane's inquiry, on the table before Lord Whitmore. Then he was silent. Lord Whitmore looked at the letter bearing Edmund Vane's name. He looked at the original notebooks. He looked at a man of legal experience who was examining the paper and the ink with the careful expression of an expert who has arrived at a conclusion. The expert said, "The ink is consistent with a manufacture not recorded before 1817. Dr. Vane died in 1814. Lady Portia's hands, folded before her on the table, did not move. "She is telling the truth," Lord Ashmore said into the silence. He did not raise his voice. "My name stands with hers." It was not, Cecily thought later, a declaration. It was not the kind of thing a man says to a woman in a drawing room with the fire lit and their hands close together. It was procedural. It was spoken at a legal table, in the language of legal proceedings, and it committed him to nothing personal at all, except that it committed him to everything. Lord Whitmore set down the letter. Lady Portia said, "I do not see how my own household arrangements can be held to account for a physician's daughter's imagination." Her voice was very level. It was the voice of a woman who has not yet accepted that the bet has been lost. Lord Whitmore said, "Lady Stanhope, you will remain available for the full inquiry." Portia's fingers moved once against the table, then were still. Lady Honoria Blaine, at her side, looked down at her own hands with the expression of someone who has been sitting in the wrong chair at the wrong table, and is only now appreciating the full significance of that fact. The hearing closed. In the corridor outside the chamber, Cecily stood with her hands folded and felt, very precisely, that the floor beneath her was the same floor it had always been, and that she was the same person she had always been, and that the world's verdict on her father and on herself had not changed because of what had happened in that room. It had only, at last, been submitted to someone with the authority to correct it. Lord Ashmore came out of the chamber behind her. He stopped a correct distance away, which was the distance propriety required, and no closer. He was still in the formal bearing of the hearing. Straight, contained, everything held at the surface, and it occurred to her that she had never seen him any other way, that whatever she had observed of the man beneath the bearing had come to her in fragments. The portrait, the quality of his attention in the doorway, the way he had said she was precisely what he believed her to be, and then looked at the fire. The corridor was cold. The winter light through the high windows was the pale, uncommitted light of February, the kind that does not decide to be either morning or afternoon, but remains suspended between them. He looked at her steadily. "The appointment will be restored," he said. "Formally, within the week." "Yes, my lord," she said. "The notebooks will be returned to you." A brief pause. His gaze moved to the window, then back. They should not have been held this long. She looked at him. He was looking at the far wall, the line of his jaw very still, the gray at his temples catching the pale corridor light. A footman passed them at the corridor's far end without looking in their direction. The sound of his footsteps receded. She thought of the portrait, turned just enough from the window that the light did not quite reach it. She thought of the way he had said she was precisely what he believed her to be, and the way he had not quite looked at her after saying it, and the way he had stood in a doorway for a full minute watching her work when there was no reason for him to stand there at all. She said, "Gideon." He turned. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. She had not known she was going to say it until it was already in the corridor between them, taking up the space a name takes when it is said by the right person at the right moment. His face changed. Not much. The way stone changes when something warm touches it, slightly, almost imperceptibly, in a direction it was not moving before. He said nothing. "Thank you," she said, "for not waiting for my letter." He looked at her for a long moment. "Eat something, Miss Vane," he said. "You look as though you have been awake since before sunrise." She had been. She nearly smiled. He inclined his head, very correctly, and left her there. She watched him go, and she did not examine too closely the particular quality of the warmth behind her breastbone, which was in the general vicinity of the vial, but was not, she was quite certain, produced by glass or ribbon. 3 months passed. Cecily's appointment was restored with a formal commendation, which was unprecedented and which the Queen delivered with the particular graciousness of a woman who understands that a large debt requires a large gesture, even when the gesture is late. Agnes wrote to her from Northumberland, where she had gone for the spring, and the letter was warm and full of the exclamation points Agnes had never quite managed to discipline out of her written voice. Mr. Fenwick sent a brief note to say that Dr. Edmund Vane's original notebooks had been bound and catalogued at the Earl of Chetford's instruction and were available to any qualified scholar who applied. Cecily read this note twice. She thought about what it meant that he had known, without being asked, which act would have been her father's preference. She thought about it a great deal. The Earl of Chetford called at the Vane townhouse on a Thursday afternoon in April, with the season well underway and the streets outside carrying the mild, particular noise of London in spring. He came formally, at the correct hour, with his card presented at the door in the manner that required a response before he was admitted. He sat in the drawing-room with his hat on his knee and a cup of tea he barely touched, and he spoke with Cecily's mother about the spring weather and about the new catalogue of the Botanical Gardens, and about a lecture series at the Royal Institution that he thought might be of interest. Cecily's mother, who was not without perception, found a reason to withdraw after 40 minutes. Cecily sat across from him in the afternoon light, which came through the drawing-room window and fell across the small pianoforte her father had bought the year she was born, an instrument she had never learned to play, but which had always been her father's particular pleasure on evenings when he was home. She turned the pages of the music on the stand while they talked, not because she intended to play, but because her hands needed something to do. He said, after a time, "There was a portrait in the office they gave me." He was looking at the pianoforte. "You will have noticed it." She said, "Yes." "Her name was Anne." He set the teacup down. "She died 4 years ago." In the spring, which is why I have spent 4 springs at the council and not elsewhere. He paused. I was not present when she needed me to be. I was in the north of England, completing an inquiry, because I told myself that the inquiry was urgent and that she would be well cared for. His voice did not change. It remained perfectly level, in the way of a man who has said a thing many times in his own head and has learned to say it without the surface changing. She was not well cared for, and I arrived 2 days after. Cecily did not say she was sorry. She had learned, from her own years of receiving condolences, that the phrase performs a social function but rarely reaches the actual place. She said, she knew that the work mattered to you. It did matter, he said. That has always been the difficulty. And now, she said. He looked at her. Now, he said, I find that other things are beginning to matter to a degree I had not anticipated. She held the edge of the music page between her fingers. The light from the window lay across the small glass vial which she had placed on the windowsill that morning when she had opened the curtains, because the April sun had made it look very clean and precise, and she had wanted to see it in the light, rather than hidden under her collar. It caught the afternoon now with a small, particular brightness. My father would have liked you, she said. Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same region. He said, I hope to have the opportunity to deserve that. He did not leave when politeness strictly required. She did not ask him to leave. Outside, the London spring moved past the window in its usual fashion, indifferent to what was happening inside. The pianoforte stood quiet at the room's edge. The light across the glass vial shifted as the afternoon deepened, and the vial held it as long as there was light to hold. If this story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments below. The stories that matter are the ones we carry forward, the way Cecily carried the vial, the way Ashmore carried the portrait. Not as burden, but as evidence of what the people we have loved were worth. Thank you for being here until the end.